Hello. The purpose of this screencast is to give you a little more information around the notes that are on this page, talk to a little bit about the 1990s, and hopefully set you up better so that you can approach this essay assignment that we have with this guiding question with a little more confidence and have a little bit more to write about. This guiding question asks, how does a democratic republic respond to peace and prosperity? We are going to use the 1990s and the period of the 1990s to highlight this question. First things first, how does a democratic republic respond? That's very similar to the last guiding question we looked at. Last time we talked about being a democratic republic, that we have a citizenry that elects representatives. Those representatives hopefully use their best judgment, but they're the ones who make the laws and pass the laws. We do not have direct democracy. So in a democratic republic, that can change things a little bit, where we have representatives that are accountable to us, but we are subject to the laws that they make and their judgments. How do we respond to peace and prosperity? Well, peace we feel pretty confident with, I imagine. Prosperity, that is material wealth. It's having money. Material needs well met. So we look at this question, how did the country, our country, as a democratic republic, how did we respond to having a good decade? A decade where no major war and conflict, a decade where the economy was good and was growing. To look at that, we'll look down here at these notes. They're here for you to review and to look over. I just want to highlight a few things. And when we think about the 1990s, we can compare those to the 2000s. A recent major magazine on their cover had 2000 to 2010 and called it the decade from hell. Well, why would we call it that? If you look at that decade, it starts with this Y2K craze, which was this computer glitch belief that computers were going to have difficulty understanding the conversion from 1999 to 2000 and that there'd be widespread computer crashes. This is a real fear. People believed this. Millions of dollars were invested to prevent this. And maybe it was necessary, but of course nothing ever happened. There was also a general millennial fear, 2000 being a big round number and certain portions of the population having apocalyptic terrors over what the 2000 year might mean. Of course that was nonsense, but by 2001 real fear had set in with the events of September 11th. And from that moment on, the era of concern for terror and terrorism had begun. And now we radically changed our foreign policy. We entered into two significant foreign wars, which are still going. Afghanistan becomes the longest war in United States history. Iraq becomes a very entrenched conflict for us, very expensive between the two wars, and a lot of controversy. The election of 2000 between Al Gore and George W. Bush, the closest election in U.S. history. Turn around in 2004, and that election between George W. Bush and John Kerry, not the closest, but again, very tight election. Really came down to one major state, Ohio. And what that shows is that politically this country is really torn. High voter turnout in 2004. And there's a lot of people feeling that we should go Republican or conservative way, and almost an equal amount of people saying we should go a liberal and a democratic way. So a high degree of political polarization, political tension, two foreign wars, the age of terror, throw in Hurricane Katrina, the largest single natural catastrophe to ever occur to a U.S. city, throw in the oil spill in the Gulf, which comes in just in time before the end of the decade, throw in a major financial crisis that is the most intense financial crisis, the most closest we've been to a Great Depression since the Great Depression. And what you have is a decade with a lot of adversity. And when you look at this decade, which you, students, have pretty much grown up in, when you look at this through the prism of all the decades in U.S. history, you would see that this decade really stands out. This past one we're just finishing, this really stands out as one of the most traumatic and adverse decades in U.S. history. Not the worst, but certainly on the short list. Compare that to the 1990s. In the 1990s, for the most part, that decade saw economic growth, on a scale that we had never seen before. The stock market in 1990, the Dow Jones is trading somewhere around 3,300, which means that a general aggregate value of the top 500 companies in the United States, their shares, were around 3,300. That same Dow Jones by the year 2000 will be 11,000. It was an economic boom. In the beginning of that decade, why were the 90s so different? Well, it had a few key elements going for it. The beginning of that decade, 1989, actually, the Berlin Wall fell. Now, we'll talk more about this as this course goes on. But just briefly, we would say that since the end of World War II in 1945, the world had been in this great global struggle between two superpowers, us, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union represented communism, we represented capitalism. And for that period from 1945 to 1989, most nations in the world sort of tucked in under the wing of either us or them. There was global tension. They call it a Cold War because we never fired directly at the Soviet Union. They never fired directly at us. But of course, many wars in this era were fought, what they call proxy wars, which we fired and engaged in wars with nations who were supported by the Soviet Union. They fought in wars in which we supported their enemies. The Korea War, Vietnam War. The Russians actually fought a war in Afghanistan in the early 80s, and we supported the Afghanis, the Afghan resistance. So there was a lot of conflict in this. Well, in 1989, the greatest symbol of the Cold War, which was the Berlin Wall, an actual physical wall that separated the city, separated a portion of the city, came down. And when it came down, it was evidence that the Soviet Union could no longer compete with the United States economy. This actually happened, scrolling down, this happened during the presidency of George H.W. Bush. You can see the note right here. It was a major, significant world event. And we'll talk more about the significance of that when we discuss the Cold War. But for the purposes of understanding the 90s, what's important to understand is the end of the Cold War meant that the United States had no peer as a nation. There was no other nation on earth that was a check or a challenge to the United States militarily. No other nation on earth that was a check or a challenge to the United States when it came to their economy. So suddenly all this tension and concern that a major war may occur was gone. That opened up a lot of consumers worldwide. Consumers that had been trapped and locked in a communist ideology, behind communist national walls. Suddenly that idea of communism was now discredited, largely, and the world was now full of new consumers and new potential workers. And there was a boom, and the United States certainly benefited from that boom. So that's one of the reasons. The end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is one of the reasons that the 90s were positioned to be this uniquely prosperous decade. The 1990s also saw the growth of some very new technologies. Now, the internet had existed for some time, since the 70s, possibly before, but the World Wide Web, the reason you type www. In front of websites, the World Wide Web is different than the internet. The internet is sort of like the road system, the network of roads. And you need to have that so that you can drive places. But the World Wide Web sort of became the cars. And the World Wide Web was developed and deployed in the 1990s. And what that meant is now suddenly, instead of just the military or certain scientists and investigators using the internet for basically email, the World Wide Web became a programming language that allowed people to build web pages and to now a new sort of consumerism. Basically everything we use the web for today, it's founded on this structure of the World Wide Web, and that originates in the 90s. Companies we take for granted, Amazon, Google, eBay, these companies are founded and formed in the mid-1990s, mid to late 1990s. And again, that's another piece of the technological boom that allows this prosperity to grow. A handful of other devices, things you'd be familiar with. Mp3 players are developed in the late 90s. iPod doesn't come till 2001, but the first Mp3 player comes in the late 90s. PlayStation comes in the 90s. PlayStation may seem like a rather ridiculous invention and not a very serious one, but you've got to keep in mind that as of this past year, the gaming industry, PlayStation, Xbox, that industry makes more money than the Hollywood industry, the movie industry. And we recognize that Hollywood movies certainly make a lot of money, and they do, but the gaming industry is a more lucrative business now than Hollywood. And I'm sure your generation would have no problem understanding that, how many people you know play games and use games. So into this decade, with all these things that are going to happen, this great prosperity, this great peace, George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, he had been president. He had been elected president in 1988, and he served until 1992. He served in 92. He was running for re-election in 92, but he had two competitors. The first competitor was a man named Ross Perot, an independent millionaire from Texas. And you would know him, perhaps in your math class you have calculators, Texas Instruments, TI. Those calculators, that's his company. And he funded his own campaign, and his campaign had two major issues. The first issue was debt. He was very concerned about the spiraling debt. And that may sound familiar today if you're paying attention to the news and you hear about a thing called the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party is also concerned about debt. Ross Perot's second great issue was the idea of outsourcing, which we'll actually talk more about later, but he was trying to predict that America would lose what he called American jobs, and we'll again come back to that. Into this dynamic comes a Democratic politician, the other opponent for George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton. Now, you probably have heard of Bill Clinton, and you probably know one thing about him at least, and that is the scandals he was a part of. Of course, Bill Clinton has many other facets to him. He was the first baby boomer president. That generation born at the end of World War II, about 1945 to about 1965. That baby boomer generation. They were the first hippie. They were the hippie generation. They were the youth of Vietnam generation. Well, he comes out of that. He's the first baby boomer to be elected president. As you can see, he's got quite a pedigree as far as education, highly educated. He served as a governor in Arkansas. And then in 1992, he wins the Democratic nomination to compete. And he wins that election against Perot and against George H.W. Bush, defeating them both. He does not get a majority of the vote. But he wins that election because he gets more of the vote than those other two, either of those other two alone. But when he wins, he does not win a majority. What that means is he enters his presidency not on a very strong footing. More people in this country had voted against him than for him. He comes in, he's a Democrat, he has liberal ideas, and he has two great policy initiatives he wants to start on that he'd campaigned on. One is he wants national health care. Again, that should sound familiar. President Obama has his most controversial legislative achievement of his short presidency at this point, just 2 years, was to pass health care. Well, Bill Clinton also wanted to pass health care, but failed. He could not pass it. Even though the times were affluent, the economy was rebounding in 92 and was going up and up, he could not pass this. The other initiative that he had campaigned on but could not pass was open service for gay and lesbian people in the military. He had campaigned that he wanted open service. He saw it as a civil rights issue and a citizen freedom issue. But when he gets into office, the military essentially tells him this is a bad idea. The Republicans, the party opposition in the House and the Senate, they do not agree with this. They don't want it to happen. And many Democrats don't agree with this, and they also don't want it to happen. And so his first two major legislative initiatives go down in failure. He has to recover on his military plan for open service of homosexuals to this thing called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And you may have heard of this as well. Don't Ask, Don't Tell as a policy becomes a failure to both sides. To the sides who didn't want gay and lesbian people in the military, it now means that they conceivably can enter, and conceivably you can't confront them or try to find them out. But if you are a gay and lesbian person, you now still, not only can you not tell, it really should be don't ask, don't show. Because if at any time any evidence is found that you are gay or a lesbian, you will be discharged from the military. So this is a compromise that satisfies no one. We'll talk more about Bill Clinton in another screencast, part 2.